I'm going to hazard a guess that you have pretty much studied the digestive system in the past, and I'm going to go further. I'm going to suggest that you are aware that when we take food, or could indeed be liquids, obviously, through the mouth, it goes down the esophagus into the stomach. You're probably aware that's kind of a churning organ. Fluid will then pass out of the stomach into the small intestine. It will be mixed with certain liquids such as pancreatic fluid and bile. It will then be absorption of our nutrients, and it will then pass into the large intestine before passing through the bottom of the anus and being excreted. That's all fine. So we are basically saying that if we were talking about food, our intake would be in the small intestine. I've just sort of isolated that small intestine here because it's kind of useful for us to do it that way. So food is taken in the small intestine, but we are interested specifically in water and electrolytes. Well, where are those taken in? Where are those absorbed? Is it along with amino acids, glucose, and glycerol and fatty acids at the small intestine? Well, the answer to that is no, it's not. And if we put our whole system back up here, what we're going to isolate now is we are going to isolate, let me get this right, we are going to isolate the large intestine. So here is the large intestine. And first of all, folks, I want you to be aware that the large intestine is the site of absorption. So it is the site of absorption, and specifically of water and electrolytes, as opposed to, for example, amino acids, let's say, in the small intestine. So we want to understand first of all. Secondly, the process, of course, and you guys, I'm sure, will remember this from your GC biology days. The process is known as osmosis for water, and water passes through the membrane, and it does so via the process of osmosis, which you know is a passive transport mechanism because you know there's no ATP involved in that back from your previous studies. That's not what today's lesson is about. Today's lesson is a more generic lesson about loss and intake. So let's think about the loss. So if we take water and electrolytes in the large intestine, fantastic. How do we lose them? Well, we lose fluids as a human being in the following ways. We lose them via evaporation. So that water that has come in here, let's say, evaporation, that water can be lost from the body, and is lost from the body, and it's done so from evaporation from the skin. Now, I'll come to another form of evaporation in a second. But when we're talking about evaporation from the skin, we are talking about when we exercise. Of course, this is going to mean exercise causes this to increase as a process. You know, we could be talking about the production or the byproduction of water as a byproduct of aerobic respiration, for example. We do this more when we are exercising in heat, or whether we're just in heat, and we do this more in humid conditions. It causes greater evaporation. Now, this one's a little bit nuanced because actually very, very humid conditions can actually prevent evaporation from taking place from the actual mechanics of that. However, of course, we will produce more sweat. Whether we'll leave is another matter. Now then, let's go back here. We've got other mechanisms of loss. We also, that was meant to be blue, we also have a second form of evaporation. And that explains how we lose fluids. And this evaporation this time is from breathing. So we breathe out water. Interesting concept, that one, isn't it? Well, what do we mean by that? Well, we are talking about water vapor. Of course, if we have got concentration gradient at the alveoli, then water vapor may well, and I'm writing that in the British English spelling, by the way, without the U would sometimes be the American English spelling, but anyway, we'll leave it at that. Now, we're talking about evaporation via breathing, but also not just water vapor leaving, but we also achieve this through something called the buffering system. Now, I've got whole tutorials on the buffering system if you're interested, but when we talk about the buffering system, it is how we take lactic acid and we're able to convert that lactic acid in the presence of the bicarbonate ion into CO2 and water via a couple of other products. Now, that I'm not going to go into details here, but I just want you to be aware that when lactic acid is produced through anaerobic glycolysis, then of course the buffering system can ultimately convert that into water and CO2, which we can then breathe out via the lungs. So that works nicely for us. Let's go a little bit further. We also lose water via excretion. And we are going to think about excretion in two ways. We're going to do a lot more on the first one. We're going to say excretion from the kidneys, and of course this is going to be in the form of urine. And we're not going to look at we're not going to look at the actual mechanics of the kidney, but we will be looking at urine control and water control. But also we have a second form of excretion, and that is excretion. I really should do this in a brown colour, but nevertheless I'm doing it in a greeny one. We're going to talk here about excretion from the large intestine. Our feces contain water from the large intestine. So when we do a poo, of course, some of that is water, one of its constituent parts is water, and of course water leaves our body in that way. So those are the mechanics by which we lose water, and of course we know that we absorb water and electrolytes in that large intestine. Now, what I want to do before we finish this tutorial, nice and simple of course, is I just want to look at a negative feedback loop. So what we are talking about here is we are looking for optimal water levels. Now we're going to look at dehydration, certain other things in other tutorials depending on which course and what you're studying, but we're thinking about optimal water levels here. But what if we start to exercise? What if it's really hot outside? What if it's really humid, or all of those things? Well, of course, what's going to happen is we are going to find ourselves in a situation where we have got decreased water levels. In other words, we are going to sweat and lose water. For example, we're going to have less water in our system. Now, what's going to happen in this situation is we are going to get a response, and we get a response by the hypothalamus. No surprise there, the same part of the brain that of course is involved in thermoregulation. And what this is going to do is it's going to signal the pituitary gland. Okay, so the pituitary gland is going to be signaled. There's an N in there. And what's going to happen here is we're going to get the production, the release of something called ADH. Now let me write that out for you. It's called antidiuretic hormone. And the ADH, what this does, it acts on the kidneys. Okay, so it acts on the I'll just put singular kidney, of course we have two of them. It acts on the kidney, and what this does is it causes less urine release. So as a result of the presence of ADH, this release, this mediator hormone ADH, the kidneys now release less water. But what if we look at the opposite cycle? What about if we drink water? What about when we stop exercising and take a hypertonic drink? What about when we sort of re-engage our fluid levels? What's going to happen here is water levels, of course, they're going to go up. No surprise by that. We drink a glass of water, say, or a sports drink, whatever it is. So what's going to happen here now is similarly the hypothalamus again. The hypothalamus is going to stimulate decrease in the pituitary gland activity, and as a result of that we are going to have a decrease in ADH production. So we have less ADH, and so of course what happens is we release urine, or more urine. So as a result of this, what happens now is that we now, when we maybe have increasing past optimal levels, water levels, we can release it in the form of pee. So there's our negative feedback loop again. That's really useful to us, and I just want to reiterate the role of ADH and the antidiuretic hormone. We will look at other hormones in the kidneys in future tutorials, aldosterone as an example, but for now that gives us a good insight. Cheers.